Scotty, a lot of people living in the country and we've got sort of village type cemeteries. Is it straightforward?
Yeah, it should be. And often the church was always the centre of the community, and it often still is. There's often very strong sort of parish and community groups, and there's lots of play centres and things operating out of them, and they are still a big part of the community on a day-to-day basis. But also a lot of them have grave sites associated with them, and those grave sites have in some situations been ceded over to the councils, whatever the local council might be, for maintenance and upkeep and for future interments. And sometimes they haven't, and sometimes they're a combination of both, where you've got a church committee that looks after it, and perhaps a curate and a minister in between them, and they are someone that you can approach to talk to about purchasing a plot. But also, because of the ways the rules and regulations work, often a council will be involved in terms of some sort of warrant recording where the burial is. They may want a slice of the action.
As in money?
Yeah. Councils take money off you? No. So it's not as simple as, say, a cemetery in a town, in an urban centre, or some of the main rural cemeteries which are purely administered by a council. For example, in the Selwyn District Council, there's 3 big cemeteries that are not associated with churches, that are the main cemeteries, but there's 19 other cemeteries that are a combination of all of the above. They are technically administered by the council, but some you have to get permission from particular church, and they'll have rules. You may have to be a parishioner or have been a parishioner and a connection with the church. It's not like you can just go out there and go, oh, that's a lovely church, and I think that'd be a really nice place to be buried, which often they are. And you might live you might be a close neighbour, but if you're not associated with the church, so
they can say no.
They often do. And so it becomes a situation where if you're a member of the community and you're thinking that you've got a parent or a loved one or someone who may be requiring or would like or has expressed a wish that they be buried in a certain locale, we are suggesting that it's not as simple as an urban burial, which a couple of days' notice between the death and the funeral was sufficient to organise everything. A lot of these scenarios they're not. And so if you haven't pre-purchased a plot and if you don't have agreement in place, you might spend a week going back and forth just to get the right person to talk to, let alone get a discussion about whether or not you can have a plot. And then there might be a committee meeting on the 3rd of the following month. And you can see how this can be a real problem for a family.
Because for a burial, time is of the essence.
Well, you've only got so many days before people are wanting to have a funeral completed, and so it's not an indefinite process, whereas unlike an ash interment, which can be delayed for months, years if necessary. And that might be another option that you look at, that the church might say no for a burial, for a casket, but they'll say yes for an ashes interment because they've got space. And space is the other issue. A lot of these areas are filling up, and some of them are very historical, and so there's historical covenants. There's what you can and can't do. Some of them are so fragile that they can't bring in a digger to work alongside.
And some of it's pretty tight because
I hand dug a grave in the S Valley Cemetery in South Canterbury, and it's solid clay. It took 8 hours with a Kango hammer because it's too narrow to get a digger in to do it. That's not something that happens overnight. That has to be organised. You have to find someone willing to do it, and some funeral directors won't do it, or they haven't got people who are willing to hand dig a grave. So there's lots of little challenges, and I think they're a rich cultural heritage, these cemeteries. We should be using them, and we should be utilising them in the sense that the ground is allocated. In many cases, it has a religious consecration. There's all those things that are there in place. It'd be great to use them, but it's not something you can just ring up on a whim and go, that's where Mum said she wanted to go. If Mum said that, then Mum or her representative needs to have that conversation and get the paperwork done early, because it is not a simple process in many situations.
So planning ahead?
Absolutely. Having a conversation, getting a price, finding out who's in charge, finding out who to contact if the person in charge moves to a new parish, which often happens with ministers and priests. They're, every 2 to 3 years, someone new comes into a district. So it's not like you've got one entity that is a constant, as you do with, say, city council or something like that.
So, okay, you've bought your plot in a churchyard.
Yes.
And then you shift to the North Island and you get very comfortable with another church, and so you sell the one you had.
Yes, and so if it was a council situation, they'd buy it back for what they paid for it. So
Yeah, okay, that's pretty fair if you bought it 20 years ago.
yeah, so I literally had a situation. It was a pre-decimal purchase, and so it was 62 or something like that, and they paid £3.50 for it, and they got $11 back, which was technically, supposedly, according to the council's mathematics, equitable. Inflation obviously wasn't a factor. So the point being is that if you do decide to change plots or to relinquish one, check with another family member who might like to take it on. That might be the first thing, or a local community person who might like to take it on, and you could sell it privately. But again, you would have to go back and get permission, if it's a church cemetery, as if they're going to be allowed to be buried there. They are particular, and some are more particular than others about what rules who can and can't go. So, like I say, it's not a difficult process, but it's one that can be a little bit time-consuming and slightly bureaucratic.
And especially when you're emotional and things like that.
It's not going to happen in 2 days' time.
Exactly.
It just isn't. So it's like all things, be a Boy Scout about it, be prepared, and it'll go smoothly, and the funeral director will know how to get it done behind the scenes so you don't have to worry about it. Don't organise it in advance, or don't have a plan in advance, and there'll be lots of frantic midnight phone calls between psych-on type contractors and funeral directors and church people, and stress that doesn't need to be in the whole process.
Very briefly, are we allowed to bury on a farm?
Yes and no. Yes, as in if you get permission from the Department of Internal Affairs, it takes about 2 years. However, there is a current Act of Parliament, and it's about second or third committee meeting, and it is being assessed as in a woodland burial, and that's going to lighten those regulatory burdens significantly. We are hoping to see this in the next sort of 12 months actually become proper legislation, but it is in the works.